Thanks for coming and being a Daphne, Emma. This is really great to have you here. My question is about the back and forth between the digital and the physical art making and what that means for you as an artist who's exploring and carrying Wabanaki visual culture with you in everything that you do. And then also specifically, I'm thinking about the double curve and the fact that it shows up in both your paintings and in your beadwork as well.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about that, that would be great.
I think that something somebody else said to me recently was this show feels like a natural trajectory in what my art has been up to this point. It's always been very graphic, and I've looked at the double curve in beadwork since I was little, and I just became obsessed with the iconography and the possibilities of working it in different kinds of ways, because you don't want that symbolism to become static either. So it's really important to change them to our current context and apply new messages to them, because we can't decipher what the double curve means necessarily anymore when we see older versions of it depicted in beadwork, for example. So I like to bring them into new contexts. And when I was thinking about the foundations of this show, about surface world through the Thanksgiving address, and that meaning being in relationship to one another, other humans, non-humans, and our environment, I think about beadwork as being kind of that separation from the land, but still connected and related in that way. And the fact that you get to carry it, I think you embody the land through your beadwork. So I started thinking about my grandmother and her activism and how she mobilized in our community and really took up political organizing through her mom and her aunt. And there were always people at her home when I was growing up. And so I got to listen to them talk and argue and work through everything in person. And that's kind of shifted maybe a little bit in how activism has shifted to online platforms. And that happened through I Don't Know More, but it's also happening now through Free Palestine movement and different resource extraction demonstrations, protests on the land. And yeah, with the show, I'm thinking about how our relationships exist in both a physical and a digital world, and what that might mean, how that might change from a community mindset to maybe an individualistic mindset, which is also fueled by capitalism. But I just think about the way that I grew up in comparison to the way my parents describe it or my grandparents describe it as being very tight-knit in community, and we still are, but it's different now.
Yeah, yeah. And the time has changed as well. But it's also that sort of closeness of community too, right? You know, the work by Barry Ace using those old receptors and capacitors and things like that. And it's the junk of the internet world, because it's all stuff that gets thrown away and deconstructed out of laptops. But then he puts it back into the patterns of the woodlands beadwork. And then he says that they continue to be receptors and capacitors and that sort of thing, because they're a way of communicating back and forth across time. And then also he talks about how the internet became this machine for Indigenous people. He always talks about the way that Indigenous people are extremely creative, and new materials come into their lives and then they use it in their own way. And so then the idea that the communication between people close by, between people in the land and in their communities, but then also between one community and another that's further and further away. And so there's that sort of always going back and forth between time as well. So
yeah,
that it fits really beautifully. And yeah, absolutely thrilled to have this work at Daphne too. So thank you. So we're in the part of the exhibition where there's three pieces that are in conversation with one another, and there's a sort of unifying media for each of them, which is the shredded paper. And we know that the shredded paper is the Indian Act. Yeah. And so do you want to talk about these three pieces and the significance of actually having the chance to tear up or put through a shredder the Indian Act?
So I started this project when I was in my undergrad at Mount Allison University in the Fine Arts program, and that was this work here. So that started as a book project, and we were only given very simple instructions to distort a book in some way. And so I raised my hand and I said, does it have to be a book, or can it be a document? Mm-hmm. And my professor smiled and he said, it can be a document. I think I know where you're going with this. And in that class, he had shown me a video of Lawrence Paul Upton shooting the Indian Act. Yes. And so that was my first introduction to that work specifically. And I thought, he stole my idea. I was living in Sackville, New Brunswick at the time, where Mount Allison is. And so I drove 15 minutes to Amherst, Nova Scotia, and went to the Indian Affairs office. And I asked them for their copy of the Indian Act because I knew I would get it on like a nice paper. And so they came out with the document. They said, you can look it up online, but I wanted to still go through those motions. And I brought the document back to school. I ran it through the paper shredder in the office. And then I started bonding it to a standard size Canadian flag, only in the red areas, because I think that it's a symbolic color for many nations. In our territory, we buried our dead in red ochre powder to preserve the body. And so I was thinking about this almost suffocation of legislation or legislative identity and how the Indian Act impacts our identity on a communal level through cultural lens and through systematic oppression as well. And with this work, through governance specifically, and how it's really impacted the way that we govern ourselves, because the Indian Act is an umbrella legislation that determines who is an Indigenous person, who is not, what is a reserve, where we can be buried, et cetera, and impose band council systems as well, which is not typically how we govern ourselves. And out east, we had many leaders, but those were typically appointed by women. And so that system was suppressed through the Indian Act.
The intention of the patriarchal system is placed on people that didn't necessarily follow that as well. And it's great that the jingle dress is the healing dress, and then to have the shreds attached to that dress as well. Just feels really interesting and sort of provocative a little bit too, right? Because it's there, but it's also the embodiment of what needs to be fixed or what needs to be used to heal, to heal us.
And with the dress, it's modeled after my great-grandmother's ribbon dress. So I copied her exact design for the pattern because she is credited as somebody who brought culture back into Tobique at a time where the church had very heavy control over education and healthcare. And when she decided to leave her post as the president of the Catholic Women's League, she was ostracized by her community. And so she received a Ford Foundation grant. She worked for the Union of New Brunswick Indians and built Fort Maliseet in Tobique, which welcomed speakers from all nations to come in and introduce culture again back into the community. And she held different ceremonies there too as well. And so with the jingle dress, it also becomes a performance because I made it to fit my body and I wear it, which is why it's kind of deteriorating here. And there are bits of dirt stuck to it because the paper rubbing up against the metal is supposed to wither it away.
Right.
The more you dance, the more the Indian Act becomes shredded.
And so the sort of third piece, they're all in conversation with one another. And we've positioned the girl in the jingle dress to look specifically at this new piece. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is brand new. I finished it just the other day and the show is opening up today. It's called To Serve and Protect. It is, again, the red serge jacket, representative of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I bought it on Poshmark, very luckily. And with this work, I'm thinking through how the RCMP has used the Indian Act to enforce assimilative legislation, again, in our communities by working with Indian agents and removing children from their homes to go to residential schools, enforcing the pass system and all of those kinds of policies.